All right, 13.2 is factoring trinomials of the type x squared plus bx plus c. So we're going to continue with the idea of factoring by grouping. The first problem here says factor x squared plus 6x plus 8. I want to make a note that the number in front of my x squared really is a 1. So when we're going to factor these, we're going to factor them by grouping, but if you remember from 13.1, when we did grouping, we always had 4 terms. We would box the first 2 and we'd circle the second 2. Right now we only have 3 terms, so we're going to rewrite this problem so that it now has 4. The first step after I write the number 1 is I'm going to underline the 1, and I'm going to underline the 8, and I'm going to multiply those 2 numbers together. So 1 times 8 is just 8. Now I'm going to make what I call the T. I'm going to make a list of the factors that I know multiply to 8. Well, the numbers that I know multiply to 8 are 1 and 8, and 2 and 4. Now I want to look for the pair of numbers that multiply to 8 but add up to the number in the middle. So the pair of numbers that multiply to 8 and add up to 6 are 2 and 4. So I'm going to rewrite this problem like this. X squared plus 2x plus 4x plus 8. Now if you notice, I have 4 terms. So I'm going to go ahead and box the first 2, circle the second. Okay, so what can I factor out of x squared plus 2x? I can factor out the letter x, and I'm left with an x plus 2. What can I factor out of 4x plus 8? Factor out the number 4, and I'm left with an x plus 2. If you notice, that's my common factor, x plus 2, and my other factor is going to be x plus 4. All right, so we figured it out, we got our answer, and all we had to do was grouping, but we had to do one step first, which was take the problem that had 3 pieces and rewrite it so that it had 4. All right, let's see if we can do the same thing with the next problem. So again, I'm going to write my number 1 here. My first step is 1 times 30 is 30. Now I'm going to make a list of all the numbers that I know multiply to 30. Well, 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 5 and 6. I'm going to stop right there because I'm looking for the pair of numbers that multiply to 30 but add up to 11, and here they are, 5 and 6. So now I'm going to rewrite this problem, x squared plus 5x plus 6x plus 30. I'm going to go ahead and box my first 2, circle my second. So out of x squared plus 5x, I can factor out the letter x, left with an x plus 5. Out of 6x plus 30, I can factor out the number 6. I'm left with an x plus 5. So there's my x plus 5. And my other factor is going to be x plus 6. And we're done. All right, so let's take a look at the next problem here. Again, my first step, let me write a 1 right here. So 1 times 9 is 9. And the numbers that I know that multiply to 9 are 1 and 9. Also 3 and 3. I want you to notice, though, they need to add up to a negative 6. So if I made that a negative 3 and I made that a negative 3, that's still going to give me a positive 9. But when I add them together, that will give me my negative 6. So I'm going to write x squared, minus 3x plus 9. Out of those first 2, I can factor out the letter x. Sorry about that. And let's do that again. Okay, I can factor out the letter x, and I'm left with an x minus 3. I'm going to circle those 2. Since that piece is negative, I'm going to take out a negative 3. I'm left with another x minus 3. So now my final answer is x minus 3, x minus 3. I can leave it like this, or if you want to, we know that we can also write it as x minus 3 squared, right? Good. Okay, let me scroll down to this next part here. All right, so now I have x squared minus x minus 20. Again, I'm going to think about that as a 1x. So 1 times negative 20 is a negative 20. So I'm going to go 1 and 20, 2 and 10, let's say 4 and 5. Okay, so again, I want you to notice that the number here is a negative 1. Since that number is a negative 1, I'm going to make this a negative 5 and a positive 4. If you notice, 4 times negative 5 gives me a negative 20. If I add them together, there's a negative 1. So now I have x squared plus 4x, minus 5x minus 20. So out of here, I'm going to go ahead and factor out the letter x. That's an x plus 4. I'm going to circle those two. I see that's negative, so I'm going to take out a negative 5. That's also going to be an x plus 4. And so now I'm going to have x plus 4 and x minus 5. Very good. Okay. And let's see if we can't do this next one too. Okay, so 1 times a negative 32. Let's see, is a negative 32. All right, so, one thing you can do, if you have a multiplication table, it's going to help you out. Because, you have 32, you start making the list of pairs, you start with 1. It's going to take you a little while to get there. So I'm going to go ahead and go to, let's say, 4 and 8. And I'm going to make that into a negative 4 and a positive 8, because negative 4 times positive 8 is negative 32. And if I add them together, there's my positive 4. So now I'll go ahead and write it out. X squared minus 4x, sorry about that, plus 8x minus 32. So again, from here, if I factor out an x, there's an x minus 4. Out of here, supposed to circle that one. If I factor out an 8, there's an x minus 4. Okay. And so now I'm left with an x minus 4 and an x plus 8. Good. All right, so the next problem we have here is 17 plus 18n plus n squared. So the first thing I notice is that this polynomial is not written in the proper order. We usually have the squared term coming first, and then the variable, and then the number by itself at the end. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to, let me get my pen again. I'm just going to rewrite that problem. I write it as n squared plus 18n plus 17. Okay, now it's in the right order. Remember, that number is 1. 1 times 17 is 17. I'm going to make a list of all the numbers that I know multiply to 17, which are just 1 and 17. And again, if you notice, they add up to an 18, right? So now we have n squared plus 1n plus 17n plus 17. So I'll box the first two. We can factor out the letter n. Now we got an n plus 1. I'm going to circle the second two. That's a 17. Now I have an n plus 1. So here's my common factor, n plus 1. And the other piece we're left with, is n plus, there we go, 17. Great. Okay. All right. Same thing here on this next problem. First thing I notice is it's not written in the right order. So let's go ahead and rewrite it as t squared. That's a positive 10t minus 24. So 1 times negative 24 is a negative 24. Okay. So I'm going to start making a list of my numbers. So 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6, right? Now we want to get a positive 10. People are really quickly to jump to those numbers, but I want you to notice that's a negative 24. That means one of those numbers is going to have to be positive, one's going to have to be negative. So the easy way to, sometimes people ask, how do I know which one's positive, which one's negative? Okay, the easy way to figure this out, if you notice, when I make my list, these are my smaller numbers, those are my bigger numbers, right? So whatever the sign is here, so notice that's positive, that's a positive 10t. My bigger numbers are going to be positive. So that's going to be a positive 24, a positive 12, a positive 8, a positive 6. Those numbers there are going to be negative, right? They have to have different signs. If you notice, if I try to combine those together, I'm not going to get a 10 anymore. If I combine these together, I will get a 10. So now I'm going to rewrite this as t squared, that's a minus 2t, a plus 12t, and a minus 24. From here, I can factor out my letter t. Now I have a t minus 2. From here I can factor out my number 12. I have again a t minus 2. So now we have what? T minus 2 and t plus 12. Okay. All right. Let's take a look at this next problem here. So it is 2z squared plus 20z plus 32. So again, the first thing I notice, I don't just have a z squared anymore. Now I have a 2z squared. So my first step is going to be, pause. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and notice that I can factor a 2 out of all those terms. So we factor a 2 out of all of these terms. Now we have a 2, there's a z squared, there's a 10z, and 2 goes into 32, what's that, 16 times? Okay. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring this 2 down all the way over here. I don't want to forget about it, but it's going to be part of my final answer, okay? So now I'm just going to look at z squared plus 10z plus 16, okay? So again, my first step, go back to my red, 1 times 16, well, that's a 16. So I'm going to look for 2 numbers that multiply to 16 and add up to 10. Well, what about 2 and 8? Okay, so now I can go ahead and factor this, z squared plus 2z plus 8z plus 16. Now box the first 2, I can factor out the letter z. There's a z plus 2. I'm going to circle those 2. I can factor out the number 8. There's a z plus 2. Okay, so right here is going to go my z plus 2. Right over here is going to go my z plus 8. And that's my entire answer. That 2 was part of my problem to begin with. It's going to be part of my answer. So typically, if I factor something out from the beginning, I'll just bring it all the way down here at the end so I don't forget about it, because it is part of my final answer, okay? So let's take a look at this next problem here. It says 3x to the third minus 12x squared plus 36x. Again, first thing I notice, there's a few things we can take out. We can take out a 3x. We're left with an x squared. Let's see, 3 goes into 12. I guess that's 4 times with an x. And 3 goes into 36, 12 times. Okay. Just like we did before, I don't want to forget my 3x because that's going to be in my final answer. So now, when I have x squared minus 4x plus 12. Okay, so remember, 1 times 12, that's 12, right? You know what, my mistake here, guys. I'm going to fix this for us. Go back to the black. This should be a positive right here. Oops, nope. Sorry about that. And let's come back here. That should be a negative, okay? Sorry about that. Negative, negative. Okay, let's make that into a negative 12. Sorry about that. Okay, so now I have looking for 2 numbers that multiply to a negative 12, and I want to get a negative 4, okay? So again, I can go, let's say 1 in 12, 2 in 6, and just like I was explaining before. So if you notice, that's a negative 12. So my signs are going to be different, right? I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to look at this sign here. Since that middle sign is negative, my bigger numbers are going to have that sign. So my bigger numbers are going to be negative, and my smaller numbers are going to be positive. Okay? And if you notice, if I combine these two together, there is my negative 4. Okay? So now let's go ahead and rewrite it. X squared plus 2x minus 6x minus 12. Out of here, I can factor out the letter x, left with an x plus 2. Circle those two, since that's a negative. Can factor out a negative 6, also left with an x plus 2. And so here, I'm going to have my common factor of x plus 2, and my other factor of x minus 6. Right? All right, so next problem here, 4x to the 4th minus 4x to the 3rd minus 48x squared. All right, so first things first again, let's go ahead and factor out what we can from the beginning. Looks like we can take out a 4x squared, and we'll be left with an x squared minus an x. Minus 4 goes into 48 12 times. Okay. I'm going to put this over here to the side, so I don't want to forget about it, 4x. Okay. So now I have x squared minus x minus 12. Okay, remember that number is a 1. Okay. Let's go back to the black for a little bit. 1 times negative 12, negative 12. So numbers that multiply to a negative 12, and in this case are going to add up to a negative 1. Let's go 3 and 4. Again, since this number is negative, my bigger number is negative, my smaller number is positive. So I'm going to have x squared plus 3x minus 4x minus 12. So from here, I can factor out the letter x. I'm left with an x plus 3. From here, I can take out the number negative 4. I'm also left with an x plus 3. All right, so we see our common factor of x plus 3, and our other factor is going to be x minus 4. And again, I don't want to forget about my 4x. So it's real important that when you're doing these types of problems, once you factor out that common factor, write it over here towards the end. You don't have to worry about forgetting it, and you'll be okay. So finally, the last problem here in 13.2, again, I'm going to write a 1 right there. 1 times 2 is 2. The only numbers that I know that multiply to 2 are 1 and 2. But those numbers don't add up to 5. Okay? Since I can't find a pair of numbers that multiply to 2 and add up to 5, what we say here is that this polynomial is prime. Okay? It just means it can't be factored. When you're doing your homework, you might have one problem, maybe 2 that are prime, okay? But that's going to be about it. The rest of them you will be able to factor, all right? So go ahead and give 13.2 a try, guys, and let me know what you guys think.